In this video, I'll show you the ins and outs of the most annoying yet effective jungler in the current metagame, and that is Hecarim. If you want a champion that can basically do a little bit of everything, be useful in every game, and be consistently able to have huge impact in your solo queue games, look no further. Here's a quick breakdown of how we'll be going over the video. I'll touch on general concepts of Hecarim's purpose as a champion, and what success looks like in games that you are doing well on him. We'll then discuss different components of his kit and how we can work better to optimize each one of these. This includes going over different jungle matchups, rune optimizations, ability maxing, your build, pathing, how to play out ganks, and how to play out each phase of the game. But first, if you haven't yet, please subscribe for more content like this. It's free and you can always unsub later if you want as well. Only 4% of you guys in my audience are currently subbed, so let's really get that number up together. On to the video. As other premier junglers have fallen off, and despite some nerfs to his own kit, Hecarim has sat comfortably at the top of the jungle food chain for the last few patches, and for good reason. With his high capability of getting good ganks off, high mobility, damage, and engage potential, Hecarim feels like a champion that can round out any team comp and is an easy win condition for any team to be playing around. By understanding what is it that makes him kit so good in solo queue, you'll be able to best maximize and potentially abuse what he has to offer. Starting off with your runes, there's a couple of viable pages that I've seen, and we can break down the strengths of each. The most prominently used rune page that I've seen on Hecarim these days is Phase Rush. Phase Rush tends to be an awesome yet consistent keystone for Hecarim, primarily because of the innate move speed in his kit and how his passive allows him to gain more damage from the extra move speed. Being able to be extremely slippery in skirmishes while also gaining damage in the process is usually a pretty unhealthy combo in the game, and Hecarim makes great use of that thanks to this rune. The other main page that some players like to go revolves around taking Conqueror as your primary keystone. Conqueror does have some well-defined strengths in its higher skirmishing power and extended fights when compared to Phase Rush, but Hecarim players have generally found more consistent success with Phase Rush as it allows Hecarim to gain up upfront damage bursts once the movement speed procs. The Phase Rush page is also good not only because of Phase Rush itself, but also because of how well the rest of the sorcery page complements how Hecarim wants to play out his kit. Don't get me wrong though, Precision is a great rune tree with a lot of banger things to choose from, but for Hecarim specifically, he has some cracked combos he can go for. Going Nimbus Cloak, Celerity, and Water Walking are all some insane runes for giving the pony some more turbo boost no matter what he's doing, which not only gives him direct damage thanks to his AD conversion, but also helps a ton in his ability to gap close and create opportunities for fights and engage angles. One of the main things that makes Hecarim such a strong pick in the current metagame is essentially the lack of counterplay when he charges at your backline at 10,000 movement speed. Other components of his kit, like his build, also come into play here, but the runes are definitely what makes the super speed playstyle so good. For your secondary tree on this Phase Rush page, I would consider it more of a personal preference decision based on what you like and what the enemy team comp has. However, if you want something that you know will always be consistently decent, Domination is typically the page to go for. The main reason for this is to access Ravenous Hunter, which is still an extremely broken rune for junglers, allowing them to consistently be able to sustain every camp without having any issues. Hecarim also takes sudden impact with this page, which gives him a good amount of oomph in his early game power. Sudden impact will proc the additional lethality when he uses his E or his ultimate, so it complements well with his kit. Precision is actually really good as a secondary tree here to access runes like Legend Tenacity and Triumph. Against CC heavy teams, the free 30% tenacity is extremely helpful for not getting locked down in fights, especially since you find yourself building Mercury treads less and less in today's metagame. I've even seen players go Inspiration as a secondary tree, taking Biscuits and Cosmic Insight. I'd consider this more of an advanced tree though, because these runes revolve around the free gold spike from the biscuits, allowing Hecarim to essentially guarantee an early Lucidity boot purchase. Moving on to his Conqueror based page, this should be taken mainly in situations where your matchup is heavily dependent on being able to build up those Conqueror stacks and win in extended skirmishes, rather than using Phase Rush for a burst of speed and damage and blowing them up. If your skirmishes are long enough to max out the stacks on Conqueror, it tends to outvalue Phase Rush in terms of its stats and is great for matchups where you're going to need that extra power in order to come out on top. Champions like Graves and Xin Zhao come to mind for this because they tend to give Hecarim a tougher time in the early game, so he needs to make sure that he can stat check them when he can. Even in these situations though, I'd argue Phase Rush is still a great choice though, so if you want one page to rely on in all situations, you can't really go wrong with Phase Rush. Going back to Conqueror though, Hecarim finishes off the Precision tree in this case by opting for Triumph, Legend Tenacity, and Last Stand. These runes all complement a bruiser type, skirmish heavy style of Hecarim that trades off some mobility and flexibility in order to be an overall stronger ball of stats. With this page, I'd say the only good secondary you should take is Domination to again access Ravenous Hunter and Sudden Impact. These runes are able to also help Hecarim in the skirmishes, which complements the Sustained Heavy Conqueror page as well. For your rune stats, you generally want to take 1 attack speed rune, 1 adaptive force, and 1 armor, for the best mix of early game clear speed and pressure. One thing I wanted to quickly stop by and address is Summoner spell choice. Hecarim is one of the few champs in the game that objectively prefers to use Ghost because it has a very flexible use case for him. The fact that it has a significantly lower cooldown than Flash and complements Hecarim's kit so much makes it a no-brainer for most games. Flash is obviously still a great rune, but to access Hecarim's maximum potential, Ghost is simply the best option. Now let's talk matchups. Hecarim's strength in matchups honestly isn't super duper impressive when compared to champs like Olaf or Graves in their prime, but he's definitely still up there as a strong force. What makes Hecarim a consistent champion in most games is his ability to make the most of a bad matchup and to negate a lot of the weaknesses of the matchup by still being an amazing contributor to fights and his team. In the early phases, he's very comfortable around most other junglers, with notable exceptions being champions like Graves, Rek'Sai, Kindred, and most notably Olaf. Most of these champions are able to either kite Hecarim off decently well in the early phases or are strong enough to simply stat check him in the cases of Rek'Sai and Olaf. Because of how fast phase rush makes you though, Hecarim can make up for these weaknesses, keeping up with most other junglers in the game, or being able to just get away and not commit to a fight when the Hecarim player determines that a certain engage just isn't worth it anymore. He's just so flexible and able to get away with so much more than the average jungle champion, which makes him really hard to shut down a lot of the time. Regardless of the matchup though, Hecarim should generally still have the same objectives as well, which is to play for heavy clears and to focus around building high tempo with his excellent clear speed, then using that to make plays with your team and just get ahead that way. Hecarim's build has seen a few iterations as we've gotten more comfortable with the changes that Season 11 has brought to the table. Starting off with his mythics, he was always good with the Trinity Force Divine Sunderer thing since he was able to proc Sheen passives so easily, but many players have now been opting for the Turbo Chem Tank Engage build. I'll quickly go over the strengths of all these mythics for Hec so you can understand what item could be best in what situation. Starting off with Sheen items, it's well understood that Hec likes to build these items because it gives him a really strong power spike in the early phases of the game. Even with just a Sheen, it feels like Hecarim gets so much stronger in skirmishes due to the spammability of his Q as well as how easily Hec can weave in Sheen autos as well. Trinity Force takes us a step further by not only enhancing the damage of the Sheen proc, but also gives Hecarim a big power boost once he picks it up, and it's probably the mythic that gives him the most damage out of all of his viable choices. Since Trinity Force gives attack speed, it also tends to be the most successful with the Conqueror page, but this doesn't mean that you should never try building it with phase rush as well. Trinity Force thrives as a Hecarim core item only in the situation where the enemy team comp is essentially made of all squishies and you don't need to worry about extended skirmishes or anything in the later phases. If you do need to worry about that and still want a Sheen item to define your build, this is the time where Divine Sunderer starts to flex its muscles. I actually think this item's a little bit undertuned at the moment, but its lack of damage may have to do with how late game focused the item is. It's very much possible that players have not been using the item properly and it's actually potentially really broken as well. The reason I say it's late game focus is because the item converts a Sheen proc into a % health damage item, as well as providing percentage hybrid penetration, which is something that Hecarim would love to have in the later stages of the game, but doesn't really need in the early phases. For this reason, if you really want to go Sunderer, it actually wouldn't be that bad of a choice to pick it up as a second or even third item at times and just sit on the Sheen for about 20 minutes or so. I think this helps give Hecarim a much more consistent power curve as well. Now on to the juicy Turbo Mach 1 Chem Boost build, which is what I've been seeing most players opt for these days. Making Turbo Chem Tank your mythic item is something I've brought up before for Hecarim, but more as a meme for nitro boosting to the enemy nexus for free LP, rather than an actual viable strategy that people would consider for competitive use cases. Nonetheless, here we are, and it turns out that Hecarim is actually pretty strong with this item. It's mainly because Chem Tanks is just a broken item right now since it provides so much movement speed for free and provides an extremely consistent engage tool for Hecarim to rely on. Hecarim's job in fights is to use all of that juicy movement speed and charge right into the enemy backline so that you can delete them and win the fight that way. Normally, AD carries would usher their teams to try to defend against that sort of dive, but it's a little bit hard to execute when the enemy champion is moving at 10,000 movement speed and has an unstoppable charge to help push himself right onto your face. If given the choice, going Chem Tank every game is extremely good and defines Hecarim as a worry-free engage tank in the later stages instead of just being a bruiser, which is both really worrying for the enemy team, but also really relaxing for the Hecarim that can just charge in whenever he wants and win a fight. Now let's talk the rest of your items, starting with boots. Lucidity boots are all the rage right now since they're simply overtuned, especially for junglers. The moment I saw them make this change a few patches ago, I knew this item was going to be broken. For 900 gold, you're getting the entire movement speed boost that you get from most tier 2 boots, as well as item plus summoner spell haste and 20 ability haste. The summoner spell haste is also straight up reducing the charge time for smite as well, which helps every jungler get more tempo. It's such a broken item in the game right now and makes so many junglers feel really good to play. This is why it's essentially your only boot option right now. It's not that the other boots are worse, it's more that this boot is just better. You always want to try and make it to the 900 gold required in order to purchase these bad boys because they really help you a ton. Other than boots and your mythic though, you'd be surprised at just how flexible Hecarim is and what items he likes to build and what you can change in order to differentiate it. It also depends on what mythic you have and what role you're playing on the team. If you're the only person that can build tank items on your team, of course that's going to mean that you want to build more defensive options, not things like Black Cleaver or Yo moves, but that doesn't actually mean that you'll never have games with these items. Hecarim can build both any AD bruiser item in the game, has really good tank item options, and if it really gets tough, can build some light AP items if he's desperate. This is usually done by again leveraging his movement speed scalings, which is why you might notice that his best build can be dangerously close to what Udyr likes to build. Players have recognized that this is essentially the Exodia build for most junglers, since it provides such a strong mix of damage and mobility, turning a lot of tanks that have never seen the light of day into stat checking beasts. In most situations, you want to be picking up a Deadman's Plate because of its already perfect synergy with what Hecarim wants to do in fights. Being able to ramp up movement speed stacks just makes Hecarim that much harder to deal with and gives him so much more speed to work with in his engages and fights. If you need an MR item that's also able to provide a similar effect, Force of Nature is also a great pickup. Items like Steric's Gauge and Black Cleaver are also really good for Hecarim if you ever need to pick up some slack on the damage front. Even tank heavy items like Randuin's Omen and Spirit Visage are actually really good for Hecarim if you need something extra to keep him up in fights. While these are all the core items that Heck will usually go for in his games, feel free to also experiment with some other ones depending on the game that you're in. Although he revolves a lot around his movement speed capabilities, overall Hecarim is still in fact another engage type bruiser, so he's able to expose himself to a wide variety of items to help him succeed. As always, I'll be keeping a downloadable item set in the description for you guys to import into the client as well. Moving on to combos, I don't think Hecarim is that combo heavy of a champion, nor does he have a high mechanical requirement to be effective on, which is part of the reason he's got such a high play rate and is so easy to be effective on. However, there are some minor optimizations to cover, mainly revolving around getting creative with his devastating charge. The first one is that while most people know how to use an EQ combo while engaging, you can actually time the Q a little bit earlier before the E actually connects in order to get your cooldown running faster. Hecarim's E also grants him a buff that empowers his next auto attack with a knockback, but a little good tidbit to know is that his ultimate will retain that auto attack buff while he's traveling in it, even if the duration was supposed to run out. This is really an intended way to help Hecarim retain really strong backline access in fights, and I actually think some people do this without realizing it. But knowing that this combo does exist and abusing it in every engage will be extremely helpful in making your Hecarim play much more consistent. So let's talk about pathing. There's a lot of things that make Hecarim really successful as a jungler right now, but the main requirement you have to pass in order to be a good jungler is to have a strong clear. Thankfully, Hecarim has always been about having to clear heavily and using that tempo to build further advantages, so the current meta is suiting him really well here. Some quick pathing optimizations to remember when playing Hecarim are using his Q and W to pull camps together so he could do them at the same time, and keeping up your Q stacks when possible when you move from camp to camp. For those unaware, Hecarim's Q grants Hecarim extra damage and reduced cooldown on subsequent Qs, and this effect stacks up to 2 times. However, this buff only lasts as long as Heck manages to hit another Q on a target within the next 8 seconds. Having the 2-stack buff for as much uptime as possible is going to help your clear significantly because it reduces the cooldown on it by so much. One other thing Hecarim can do to speed up his clears is to take 2 points in Q at level 3. This feels really unintuitive at first because skirmishing gets really awkward, but so you have to commit to clearing if you do this, but doing so will really speed up the latter half of your first clear by a lot. When it comes to your initial pathing though, Hecarim can start either side and still be relatively quick on his clear. He wants to clear all 6 camps in most situations in solo queue, but you can adapt to a gank if you think there's a good opportunity that presents itself. So on blue side, you want to clear blue, Gromp, and wolves, and then go chickens, red, krugs into crab. If you took 2 points into queue here, you'll usually finish around 315 and be able to contest the nearest crab. Starting on red side, you essentially just reverse clear with the order I said on blue, starting off with red into krugs and chickens, then moving to wolves, Gromp, and blue into a crab. This clear is slightly slower since you're dealing with a single target camp without a leash, so you may have to skip a camp if you see the enemy jungler taking crab, but it's still really good regardless. After that though, as with most junglers in the game right now, your clears will still be heavily focused on high tempo to make sure that you cycle as many camps as possible while weaving in ganks where you see them. Let's talk about how to gank on Hecarim. So ganks on Hecarim are probably the most annoying thing to deal with because of how effective they are. The massive movement speed buff that he gets to fuel his ganks with is just so broken because of how easily he can get behind the enemy and set up for his team. team. Although starting a gank behind the enemy jungler is ideal, you can still get away with just running in through lane at times too. The best way to ensure a strong gank on Heck is to use your pushback on the E to shove the enemy towards your teammates. If it isn't possible, just making sure the E at least connects will be what you're looking for, but getting that mini insect would really increase your chances. Post 6, also make sure to use your ultimate to break any potential CC the enemy may toss at you, since that essentially guarantees a free gap close. The same sort of idea continues when you move on to the team fighting stage, except that instead of diving maybe 1 to 2 people, you'll be going after the backline through potentially up to all 5 of the enemy team. It's very important to recognize that Hecarim's job is indeed to dive the backline because he's not able to bring very much to the table otherwise. His front to back team fighting isn't exceptionally powerful and just doesn't make sense for his kit since he's able to access the backline so easily. If you manage to delete the enemy control mage or AD carry, you've already essentially won the fight in a lot of scenarios, so charging up your E and then using your ultimate to carry you forward is a great way to get things started, and it's why Hecarim is so awfully painful to deal with right now, necessitating champion picks like Xayah to come back into the metagame. Once you're in the enemy backline though, there is just no going out at that point, so you should really hope that your team commits to the fight alongside you, because the only thing you can do at that point is just get as much damage done as possible. Using your Chem Tank plus E combo is also going to be your bread and butter engage here to get you as much distance as possible without using your ultimate as well. Overall, Hecarim is just an incredibly overloaded kit right now that allows him to be super disgusting in basically all stages of the game and in almost every aspect of League right now. He brings an incredible amount of presence and impact to the table in every game that he's involved in, and I highly recommend that you pick him up for your future games. Hope this guide finds you well, and I will see you in the next one. Stay fresh, brothers.